On September 21st, the world witnessed a moment that felt less like an interview and more like an explosion. Sitting across from a French journalist on TV Monde, Mohamed El Maouloud Ramadan, the spokesperson of the armed group FLA, calmly admitted what Mali had been warning for years. His organization maintains good contacts not only with France, but also with Ukraine and the United States. A simple sentence spoken in a tailored suit shook the foundations of Sahel politics. Was this not the confession of foreign interference that Bamako has long denounced? And if so, what doors does it open for destabilization in the years ahead? Just days later, on September 30th, another statement caught fire across Africa. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, marked 3 years since his revolution by delivering a warning no one could ignore. He accused Côte d'Ivoire of striking a secret non-aggression pact with terrorists. According to him, the absence of attacks on Ivorian soil does not prove military strength. It reveals a dangerous bargain. In his words, "When you make peace with terrorists, you become their rear base of operations." For millions who remember the waves of violence in West Africa, those words carried both fear and truth. Here lies the question for all of us, including viewers here in America. Are we finally seeing undeniable proof that outside powers and regional governments are willing to play with fire even at the cost of ordinary lives? Or are these simply accusations thrown in a storm of politics and war? What happens next in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Côte d'Ivoire will shape the security of an entire continent. And it will test whether President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for sovereignty can withstand not only bullets and bombs, but whispers and backroom deals. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. It began not in the deserts of Mali, nor in the crowded streets of Ouagadougou, but in a Parisian television studio. Under the bright lights of TV5 Monde, Mohamed El Maouloud Ramadan, spokesperson for the Front de Libération de l'Azawad FLA, leaned forward in his chair and spoke words that could not be taken back. Yes, he said, we have good contacts with the Ukrainians, with France, and with the United States. For decades, Mali has accused foreign powers of quietly pulling the strings behind its endless northern rebellions. The government in Bamako insisted that groups like the FLA were not acting alone, that weapons, intelligence, and money were flowing from far beyond the Sahel. But until September 21, 2025, these claims were dismissed in the West as propaganda or the paranoia of weak governments. Now, a man in a suit on a respected French channel had confirmed them. The FLA is not a minor player. Born out of Tuareg separatist movements after the fall of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, the group claimed to fight for independence in northern Mali. Yet its record was soaked in blood ambushes against the Malian armed forces, Fama raids on villages, and cooperation with jihadist factions tied to al-Qaeda. To ordinary Malians, the FLA was not a liberation front, it was a terrorist machine, and now its spokesman openly admitted to maintaining good relations with Western governments. The reaction in Mali was immediate. Officials in Bamako repeated their warnings. France, Ukraine, and the United States were undermining Malian sovereignty by nurturing armed groups. Moscow added its voice, pointing to Ukraine's recruitment of mercenaries and its alleged supply of drones and weapons through shadowy channels in West Africa. Within weeks, both Mali and Niger cut diplomatic ties with Ukraine entirely, accusing Kyiv of supporting terrorism in the Sahel. The symbolism of the interview mattered as much as the words. Why TV5 Monde? Why France? To Malian leaders and many across the region, it was proof that French media served not just as journalists, but as megaphones for destabilization. This is not just a war fought with guns, one analyst remarked. It is also fought with microphones, cameras, and headlines. By giving a terrorist spokesman prime airtime, Paris was accused of legitimizing rebellion while stripping Mali's government of its own narrative. But the confession raised deeper questions. What exactly do good contacts mean? Were weapons exchanged? Was it intelligence sharing, or was it the kind of tacit understanding that allows groups like the FLA to survive, to regroup, and to return stronger after every Malian offensive? For villagers in Gao, Timbuktu, or Kidal, such nuances mattered little. They only saw that rebels seemed to receive supplies while government convoys lacked fuel. They saw drones circling the skies that their army could not afford. They buried sons who died fighting men with rifles far too new to have been scavenged from old wars. This is where the power of a sentence lies. When Mohamed Ramadan confirmed good contacts, he was not simply making conversation. He was admitting that Mali's war was not just against a ragtag militia, but against a network, one that stretched from the deserts of Azawad to the capitals of Europe and even Washington. And while the world debated whether this was proof or mere rhetoric, the political fallout spread. Inside Mali, the statement strengthened public support for the current leadership, which has built its legitimacy on resisting Western interference. Citizens felt vindicated. The enemy was not only the gunman on the motorcycle, but also the diplomat shaking hands in foreign capitals. Beyond Mali, the echoes were just as sharp. Niger and Burkina Faso, now bound together with Mali in the alliance of Sahel states AS, saw the interview as validation of their own suspicions. If the FLA had outside sponsors, then the struggle for sovereignty was larger than any one country. It was continental. It was about whether Africa could resist the divide-and-rule strategies that had haunted it since the colonial era. This single interview thus became more than a news clip. It became evidence, whether direct or symbolic, that the Sahel was caught in a chess game where local militias were pawns and the real players sat in Paris, Kiev, and Washington. For Ibrahim Traoré and his allies, it confirmed what they had been saying for 3 years. Africa's revolutions are not only about cleaning up corruption or building schools, but about surviving in a world where even terrorists can be given a stage by global powers. The world heard the words. The question now was how far their consequences would reach. If the TV5 Monde interview was the spark, what came next was the firestorm. On September 30th, 2025, Captain Ibrahim Traoré marked the 3rd anniversary of his popular revolution in Burkina Faso. In what was supposed to be a moment of national reflection, he shifted the conversation to an accusation that stunned the region. Côte d'Ivoire, he declared, was not being spared terrorist attacks because of military might, but because of a secret deal. They flirt with terrorists. Traoré said, his voice heavy with both anger and warning. There is a pact of non-aggression, and when such a pact exists, you become their rear base of destabilization. These words cut deeper than any battlefield clash. For decades, Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire shared blood ties, economic lifelines, and millions of migrants who crossed borders for work. Families were blended across Ouagadougou and Abidjan. The suggestion that Côte d'Ivoire might knowingly host, protect, or even bargain with the very groups terrorizing Burkinabe villages was more than a political accusation. It was a wound to the soul of the region. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Supporters of Traoré hailed him as courageous, a leader unafraid to say aloud what others whispered in private. To them, the strange immunity of Côte d'Ivoire from large-scale terror attacks was not coincidence but compromise. How else, they asked, could a nation sitting beside Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, all bleeding daily from insurgencies, remain untouched? Opponents, particularly Ivorian voices, bristled with outrage. Callers to televised debates insisted that Traoré was playing politics, scapegoating Côte d'Ivoire to cover his own struggles. They reminded audiences that Burkina Faso still suffered relentless attacks, despite promises to secure the nation in 6 months. If you have proof, show it, one Ivorian caller demanded. Otherwise, stop putting millions of Burkinabe who live in Côte d'Ivoire at risk with such words. The anger was not feigned. For Ivorian citizens, being branded as accomplices of terrorists felt like a betrayal of their hospitality to generations of Burkinabe migrants. But the accusation did not stand alone. Analysts pointed to history. During the era of Blaise Compaoré, Burkina Faso itself was accused of hosting militants in luxury villas at Ouaga 2000 while enjoying relative calm at home. When Compaoré was ousted, Burkina Faso immediately became the target of frequent attacks, suggesting that deals with armed groups had collapsed. Traoré's warning then was not without precedent. If you make peace with wolves, one commentator said, you may be spared for a time. But eventually, when the food runs out, the wolves will turn on you. International observers also weighed in. Some saw Traoré's words as a strategic message aimed not only at Abidjan, but at Paris. Côte d'Ivoire's President Alassane Ouattara is often described as France's closest ally in West Africa. If Burkina Faso could frame him as colluding with terrorists, it would not only discredit him domestically, but also weaken France's last strong foothold in the region after being pushed out of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. At the grassroots level, the reactions were more visceral. In border villages, elders shook their heads, recalling how easy it was for armed men to slip across forested paths. Traders worried about the future of commerce if relations soured further. Families feared for their sons, whether as soldiers on the front lines or as migrants working in Ivorian factories caught in the crossfire of political accusations. Meanwhile, supporters of Traoré emphasized his consistency. He had warned repeatedly that one cannot compromise with terrorism. For them, his blunt words were not a diplomatic misstep, but an act of honesty. He speaks like a soldier, said one Burkina Faso farmer interviewed by state television. Better an honest truth that burns than a sweet lie that kills us slowly. The climax of this unfolding drama lies in the collision of two narratives, one of Côte d'Ivoire as a peaceful, stable state shielding itself through strength, and another of Côte d'Ivoire as a silent accomplice buying calm at the price of its neighbor's blood. Which story prevails will shape not just the relationship between Abidjan and Ouagadougou, but the fragile security architecture of the entire Sahel. For now, the accusations hang in the air like a storm cloud that could either pass quietly or unleash a tempest. And everyone, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and even distant observers in Washington and Paris, waits to see which way the lightning will strike. The storm of words between Ouagadougou and Abidjan may appear on the surface like another episode in West Africa's endless political theater. But beneath the speeches and the headlines lies a far heavier burden: the lives of ordinary people. For civilians, the accusations of a non-aggression pact with terrorists are not abstract. They translate into anxiety on the ground. In villages near the Burkina Faso Ivorian border, farmers and truck drivers whisper of new checkpoints, of longer journeys, of sudden fear where once there was routine trade. A trip to sell tomatoes in Bunduku or to deliver cattle toward Abidjan suddenly feels like crossing into suspicion. If the two governments drift into open hostility, it is not diplomats who will pay. First, it is the woman who sells her goods at the roadside, the student who commutes for classes, the migrant worker who depends on remittances to feed his family back home. Politically, the rift threatens to undo decades of fragile regional cooperation. Côte d'Ivoire has long been an economic engine for the region, absorbing millions of workers from Burkina Faso. Any perception that Abidjan is colluding with insurgents jeopardizes not just security, but also livelihoods. A climate of mistrust could trigger mass expulsions or stricter border controls. History offers painful reminders. During previous crises, Burkina Faso migrants in Côte d'Ivoire often became scapegoats, targeted by xenophobic rhetoric or violence. If Traoré's accusations deepen, that old wound could reopen. Inside Burkina Faso, the speech reinforced Traoré's image as a defender of sovereignty. His supporters see in him a man unafraid to challenge powerful neighbors, even those tied closely to France. Yet domestically, the challenge grows heavier. The Burkina Faso population, weary of promises to end insecurity, expects tangible results. Every new attack on a village becomes a test. Is Traoré's war on terror effective, or is it slipping into the same cycle of declarations and funerals that haunted previous governments? For Côte d'Ivoire, the political consequences are equally sharp. President Alassane Ouattara has built his reputation on stability and economic growth. Being painted as a silent partner of terrorists damages both his domestic credibility and his international standing. If his government cannot convincingly counter Traoré's charge, he risks appearing either complicit or weak. In a country where memories of civil war remain raw, that perception could fracture the delicate balance he has maintained for over a decade. Regionally, the ACE alliance Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger may harden its position, treating Côte d'Ivoire as a potential adversary rather than a reluctant neighbor. Such polarization risks turning West Africa into a checkerboard of alliances where trust evaporates and every border crossing carries political weight. For institutions like ECOWAS, already weakened by sanctions and boycotts, the growing hostility could spell further irrelevance. And at the deepest human level, the consequences are psychological. To live under the suspicion that one's neighbor has made a deal with the enemy erodes the fragile bonds that hold societies together. It breeds resentment, suspicion, and fear, fertile ground for extremists who thrive on division. The words have been spoken. The political consequences are unfolding, but for the civilian walking dusty roads between Ferkessédougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, the greatest question remains heartbreakingly simple. Will tomorrow bring trade and family visits, or borders lined with soldiers and whispers of betrayal? From Washington to Paris, from Brussels to Moscow, the words exchanged in West Africa did not go unheard. when Ibrahim Traoré accused Côte d'Ivoire of making a pact with terrorists, and when Mali pointed to Ukraine's involvement with northern rebels, the shockwaves quickly reached the desks of policymakers far beyond the Sahel. For the United States, the revelation carried a double edge. On one hand, Washington insists on its role as a partner in counterterrorism, providing training and intelligence to governments in the region. On the other, to hear its name mentioned in the same breath as France and Ukraine as a friend of armed groups was a reputational blow. American officials at least publicly denied any such ties. Yet in private circles, analysts asked hard questions: had U.S. funding to non-governmental programs or military contractors inadvertently filtered toward actors like the FLA? Was the American presence in West Africa still viewed by locals as security support, or had it become, in perception if not fact, another form of interference? In Europe, the reaction was even sharper. France already expelled militarily from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger faced another humiliation. Dive Monday's decision to host Mohamed Ramadan on air was condemned across African media as proof that Paris gave a microphone to insurgents. French diplomats scrambled to insist that media freedom should not be equated with state policy, but the damage was done. For much of Africa's public opinion, the interview confirmed what they long suspected: France still plays a shadowy hand in the region's conflicts. Ukraine, meanwhile, found itself in a storm it could ill afford. Fighting for survival at home against Russia, Kyiv has sought allies across the global south. But accusations of supplying drones or maintaining ties with armed groups in Mali triggered a backlash. Within days, both Mali and Niger cut diplomatic relations. For Kyiv, already struggling to rally African support at the United Nations, the perception of arming terrorists was devastating. Russia seized the moment. Russian officials reminded audiences that they had warned for years about Western interference. Moscow framed itself as the reliable partner providing weapons security contractors and political backing without hidden deals. Whether this portrayal is entirely true or not, the narrative resonated across African airwaves. To many in the Sahel, Russia appeared as the partner that stood against terrorism without compromise, while the West appeared duplicitous. The broader world, too, began to watch with unease. International NGOs warned of a potential humanitarian disaster if relations between Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire collapsed. A breakdown would not only disrupt trade and displace communities, but could destabilize an entire corridor stretching from the Gulf of Guinea deep into the Sahara. The United Nations called for restraint, urging dialogue instead of mutual blame, though its words often carried little weight with leaders who felt betrayed by global institutions. For the American public, particularly older generations who remember Vietnam and Iraq, the echoes are haunting. Once again, a faraway region appears to show the fingerprints of great powers entangled in local wars, blurring the line between helping and manipulating. And once again, the people paying the price are not policymakers in Washington or Paris, but farmers in Kidal, traders in Bobo Dioulasso, and children walking to school under the shadow of armed men. As global powers maneuver, the question for the world is simple but urgent. Is West Africa a partner in its own right, or just another battlefield in someone else's war? The Sahel today feels like a chessboard where the pawns bleed while the kings remain safe. A single interview on French television, a single speech in Ouagadougou, and suddenly the stability of millions of lives is in question. But this is the reality in West Africa. Words can be as dangerous as weapons. They can open wounds between nations, cast suspicion across borders, and embolden enemies who thrive on division. Ibrahim Traoré's warning to Côte d'Ivoire is more than a quarrel between neighbors. It is a reminder that when governments choose compromise with extremists, whether real or perceived, the first victims are civilians. When outside powers play games with local militias, the region is set aflame not just politically, but socially and economically. Markets close, families scatter, trust evaporates. And for America and the world, ignoring these flames will only invite greater fires tomorrow. The lesson is clear: sovereignty cannot be traded in backrooms, and peace cannot be built on secret pacts. If Côte d'Ivoire is innocent, it must prove its commitment with transparency. If Ibrahim Traoré is right, then the region must prepare for consequences that will not stop at one border. So tonight I leave you with two questions. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's reform strategies are strong enough to resist both terrorism and political betrayal? And if not, who should carry this struggle forward for the people of Burkina Faso and the Sahel? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because in this storm of words and weapons, silence is not neutrality, it is surrender.